The Department of Justice's Federal Programs Branch, nestled within the labyrinthine corridors of Washington, D.C., was once a bastion of legal rigor, where career attorneys prided themselves on defending the United States government's policies with precision and integrity. In early 2025, however, the air within the DOJ's headquarters carried a different weight, a palpable tension that clung to the walls like damp fog. For the 110 lawyers of the Federal Programs Branch, tasked with defending the federal government against lawsuits challenging its policies, the arrival of President Donald Trump's second term marked a turning point. By mid-July 2025, nearly two-thirds of the branch, 69 attorneys, had either resigned or announced their intent to leave, a mass exodus unprecedented in the department's history. The catalyst? A relentless barrage of executive orders from the Trump administration, coupled with a directive from Attorney General Pam Bondi that demanded unwavering loyalty to the president's agenda. Policies targeting birthright citizenship, mass deportations, federal funding cuts to institutions like Harvard University, and sweeping bureaucratic overhauls pushed the legal envelope in ways that left many career lawyers reeling. These attorneys, many of whom had served through multiple administrations, found themselves caught between their ethical obligations to the courts and the administration's insistence on defending what some deemed constitutionally dubious policies. Among these lawyers was Sarah Mitchell, a fictional composite of the real attorneys who faced this dilemma. Sarah, a seasoned litigator in her late 30s, had joined the DOJ a decade earlier, drawn by the promise of upholding the rule of law. She had weathered the first Trump administration, defending policies she sometimes disagreed with but could justify within the bounds of legal precedent. This time, however, the demands were different. The pace was unrelenting, the policies audacious, and the pressure from above suffocating. Sarah's story, woven from the threads of real accounts, illustrates the human toll of this unprecedented crisis within the DOJ. On January 20, 2025, as Donald Trump was sworn in for his second term, the DOJ braced for change. Attorney General Pam Bondi, a staunch Trump ally, wasted no time. On her first day, she issued a memo to the Federal Programs Branch, a directive that would become infamous among the career attorneys. The memo demanded zealous advocacy for the president's agenda, warning that any deviation, any hint of personal or ethical reservations, could result in disciplinary action or termination. For Sarah, the memo landed like a thunderclap. She had always viewed her role as defending the government's policies, not the personal whims of any president. The Federal Programs Branch was meant to represent the United States, not a single individual. Yet Bondi's memo framed the DOJ lawyers as the president's lawyers, a characterization that grated against Sarah's understanding of her oath. The policies themselves were a lightning rod. Trump's executive orders included attempts to end birthright citizenship, a direct challenge to the 14th Amendment, mass deportations without due process, and sanctions against law firms perceived as disloyal. Each order sparked a flood of lawsuits, overwhelming the branch's already strained resources. Sarah and her colleagues were tasked with defending these actions in court, often with little time to prepare and scant legal grounding to support their arguments. In one case, Sarah was assigned to defend the administration's attempt to freeze $2.5 billion in funding to Harvard University, a move critics argued was retaliatory and unconstitutional. The legal brief she was handed by her supervisors was thin, relying on vague assertions of executive authority rather than robust precedent. When she raised concerns during a team meeting, her supervisor, a political appointee named Richard Lawson, dismissed her objections. "The president's agenda is clear," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "We're here to execute, not to question." Sarah felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had joined the DOJ to defend the Constitution, not to rubber stamp policies that seemed to flout it. But the pressure was relentless. Bondi's memo loomed over every decision, and whispers of firings, such as that of Erez Reuveni, a veteran lawyer suspended for failing to vigorously defend a deportation case, sent a chill through the branch. By March 2025, the Federal Programs Branch was a pressure cooker. The workload was crushing, with over 200 lawsuits challenging Trump's initiatives clogging the courts. Judges, from both liberal and conservative benches, grew increasingly frustrated with the DOJ's inability to provide coherent legal defenses. In one hearing, U.S. District Judge John Bates openly scoffed at Richard Lawson's arguments defending sanctions against the law firm Jenner and Block, questioning how a former employee's actions years earlier could justify such measures. "Give me a break," Bates said, his exasperation echoing through the courtroom. Sarah was in the gallery that day, watching as her colleagues struggled to answer basic questions about the administration's policies. She knew Lawson wasn't unprepared. He was hamstrung by orders from above to avoid disclosing key details. The administration's strategy, as Sarah had pieced together from internal memos, was to push the legal boundaries as far as possible, relying on a sympathetic Supreme Court to overturn lower court losses. But this approach came at a cost. Judges accused DOJ lawyers of shoddy work and willful noncompliance, eroding the department's credibility. The breaking point for Sarah came in April, during a case involving the administration's use of the Alien Enemies Act to deport alleged Venezuelan gang members. The policy, enacted with little transparency, led to the rapid deportation of dozens of migrants, some with active asylum cases. Sarah was tasked with defending the action in a hearing before U.S. District Judge Paula Zinis, who demanded answers about the deportation's logistics and legal basis. Sarah's superiors, however, refused to provide the necessary information, citing state secrets. In the courtroom, Sarah felt her integrity unraveling. She knew the administration's claims were shaky, and her inability to provide clear answers drew a sharp rebuke from Judge Zinis. "This court takes clear offense to respondents wasting judicial resources," the judge wrote in her ruling, ordering the return of a wrongfully deported man, Kilmar Abrego Garcia. Sarah's colleague, Erez Reuveni, had already been fired for admitting to the court that the administration withheld information in that case. Sarah feared she might be next. That night, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, staring at her DOJ badge. She thought of her early days in the branch, when she had argued cases with pride, knowing her work upheld the rule of law. Now, she felt like a pawn in a political game, forced to choose between her career and her conscience. She wasn't alone across the branch. Colleagues were resigning in droves, citing the same reasons: an overwhelming workload, ethical dilemmas, and fear of professional repercussions. By July 14, 2025, the scale of the exodus was impossible to ignore. Reuters reported that 69 of the 110 lawyers in the federal programs branch had left or were planning to leave, a staggering 62.7% turnover rate. The reasons were manifold. Some, like Sarah, were demoralized by the ethical compromises demanded of them. Others were simply exhausted by the relentless pace of litigation. At least 4 lawyers told Reuters they quit over concerns that Trump's policies, such as gutting federal agencies or targeting institutions like Harvard, violated the Constitution. The departures weren't limited to the federal programs branch. The DOJ's Civil Rights Division was also hemorrhaging staff, with 70% of its attorneys, roughly 250 lawyers, either leaving, accepting deferred resignations, or being reassigned to tasks unrelated to civil rights enforcement. The division, once a bulwark against discrimination, was being redirected to enforce Trump's priorities, such as combating gender ideology extremism and alleged anti-Christian bias. Sarah's friend, Omar Nuruldan, a former Civil Rights Division attorney, described the situation as the end of the division as we've known it. He told her of colleagues who were reassigned to handle public records requests or internal complaints, tasks far removed from their expertise in housing discrimination or voting rights. The message from the administration was clear: align with Trump's agenda or leave. The White House, however, remained defiant. Spokesperson Harrison Fields issued a statement defending the administration's policies as legal and citing historic legal victories in district courts and the Supreme Court. Yet the reality was more complex. While the administration had won some cases, particularly at the Supreme Court, lower courts had blocked Trump's executive actions at least 64 times, according to an Associated Press tally. The DOJ's struggles to mount credible defenses were becoming a liability. The human cost. For Sarah, the decision to resign was agonizing. She had student loans to pay, a mortgage, and a young daughter to support. The DOJ had been her professional home for a decade, and leaving meant walking away from a stable career into an uncertain future. But the alternative, continuing to defend policies she believed were unlawful, was untenable. She remembered the words of a former colleague, Stacey Young, who had left the DOJ earlier that year: "The Justice Department exists to enforce the law, not to enact the president's agenda." Sarah wasn't alone in her struggle. Across the DOJ, career attorneys grappled with similar dilemmas. Some, like Ryan Crosswell, who resigned after refusing to support a motion to withdraw a corruption case against New York Mayor Eric Adams, spoke out publicly. Others left quietly, taking jobs in private practice or academia, where they could escape the political pressure. The loss of institutional knowledge was staggering. Seasoned lawyers, who had navigated complex litigation across administrations, were replaced by less experienced political appointees or temporary transfers from other DOJ divisions. The administration's response was to exempt the DOJ from Trump's federal hiring freeze, allowing a scramble to fill vacancies. But the new hires, often loyalists with ties to Trump's inner circle, lacked the expertise of their predecessors. Richard Lawson, for example, had worked with Bondi at the America First Policy Institute before joining the DOJ. Critics argued that these appointees prioritized loyalty over competence, further eroding the department's credibility. The courts pushed back. As the DOJ bled talent, the courts became a battleground. Judges, frustrated by the administration's tactics, began to push back. In one case, U.S. District Judge Beryl Howell ruled that Trump's sanctions against the law firm Perkins Coie were unconstitutional, chastising Richard Lawson for failing to provide basic details about the policy. In another, Judge Leonie Brinkema in Virginia called the DOJ's evidence in an immigration case shoddy, threatening to eject the government's lawyer from her chambers. The most high-profile case involved Kilmar Abrego Garcia, a Salvadoran immigrant with legal status who was wrongfully deported to El Salvador. Judge Paul Azinis called the deportation wholly lawless, ordering Garcia's return. The case exposed deeper fissures within the DOJ. Erez Reuveni, the lawyer assigned to the case, was fired after admitting to the court that the administration had withheld critical information. His whistleblower complaint, later filed with Congress, alleged that DOJ leadership, including Acting Deputy Attorney General Emile Bove, had pressured attorneys to mislead judges and defy court orders. Reuveni's allegations sent shockwaves through the legal community. He claimed that Bove had instructed attorneys to prioritize the administration's deportation goals over judicial mandates, even suggesting they tell judges, "Fuck you," if necessary. The accusations, backed by text messages and emails, painted a picture of a DOJ under siege, where career lawyers were caught between their ethical duties and political pressure from above. Sarah read about Reuveni's complaint in the New York Times, her heart sinking as she recognized the truth in his words. She had witnessed similar pressures in her own cases, where supervisors demanded loyalty to the administration over candor to the court. The DOJ, once a symbol of impartial justice, was being reshaped into an arm of the White House, a transformation that alarmed even conservative legal scholars. The public reaction. The exodus of DOJ lawyers became a lightning rod for public debate. On X, posts reflected a polarized sentiment. Some users, like at RealTuckFrumper and at FXShe62, decried the administration's actions, calling for Bondi's resignation and accusing the DOJ of becoming Trump's purse. Defense team. Others, like at Demand Justice 25, mocked the situation with dark humor, joking that, even lawyers have to draw the line at taco. On Reddit, the r/politics and r/law communities buzzed with discussion. Users like u/Bunzies, who posted about the exodus, garnered thousands of upvotes and comments. Some praised the lawyers for standing up to Trump, arguing that public funds shouldn't be used to defend a criminal. Others worried about the long-term damage to the DOJ, predicting a department filled with low-experience ideologues that would struggle to rebuild when a new administration took over. The mainstream media amplified the story. The Daily Beast, Reuters, and the New Republic reported on the exodus, framing it as a crisis of morale and ethics within the DOJ. The New York Times and NPR highlighted the judiciary's growing frustration, with judges accusing DOJ lawyers of losing credibility. Even conservative outlets like Fox News covered the story, though they often downplayed the controversy or shifted focus to Trump's robust economic agenda. For Sarah, the media coverage was both validating and disheartening. It confirmed that she wasn't alone in her concerns, but it also underscored the scale of the crisis. The DOJ, an institution she had revered, was unraveling under the weight of political pressure. She wondered how it would recover, and whether she could ever return. The path forward. By July 15, 2025, Sarah made her decision. She submitted her resignation, effective immediately, and accepted a job at a nonprofit focused on civil liberties. The pay was lower, the hours uncertain, but the work aligned with her values. As she packed her office, she reflected on her time at the DOJ. She had argued before federal judges, shaped legal precedent, and mentored younger attorneys. But she couldn't reconcile staying in a department that demanded she compromise her principles. Sarah's departure was one of many, but it wasn't the end of the story. The DOJ scrambled to fill the vacancies, recruiting from conservative law schools and transferring attorneys from other divisions. Yet the loss of institutional expertise was undeniable. Peter Keisler, a former DOJ official under George W. Bush, warned that no administration had ever pushed the legal envelope so aggressively, leaving the department dramatically thinned at a time of unprecedented demand. The administration's legal strategy, meanwhile, showed no signs of slowing. With a Supreme Court increasingly favorable to executive power, Trump's team seemed willing to gamble on higher court reversals, even as lower courts blocked their actions. The DOJ's new hires, many of them political appointees like Drew Ensign and Richard Lawson, faced a steep learning curve, often struggling to match the expertise of their predecessors. For the remaining lawyers, the path forward was uncertain. Some stayed, hoping to outlast the administration and preserve the DOJ's integrity from within. The mass departure of DOJ lawyers left a void that would take years to fill. The Federal Programs Branch, once a powerhouse of legal talent, was a shadow of its former self. The Civil Rights Division, similarly gutted, faced a future where its traditional mission, protecting voting rights, combating discrimination, was sidelined in favor of Trump's priorities. For Sarah, the decision to leave was bittersweet. She missed the camaraderie of her colleagues, the thrill of arguing in court, the sense of purpose that came with serving the public. But she couldn't ignore the erosion of the DOJ's independence, the pressure to bend the law to fit a political agenda. Her story, like those of the 69 lawyers who left the Federal Programs Branch, was a testament to the human cost of a polarized era. As the Trump administration pressed forward, the courts remained a battleground. Judges continued to challenge the DOJ's arguments, demanding transparency and accountability. The public, divided as ever, watched closely, some cheering the lawyers' resistance, others decrying their departure as disloyalty. The DOJ, caught in the crossfire, faced a reckoning that would shape its legacy for years to come. Epilogue: The Long Shadow. By the end of 2025, the DOJ's struggles were far from over. The administration's legal battles continued, with new lawsuits emerging daily. The exodus of lawyers had slowed, but the department's reputation was battered. For Sarah and her former colleagues, the fight for justice continued outside the DOJ, in classrooms, nonprofits, and private firms. They carried with them the lessons of their time in the Federal Programs Branch, that the law is a fragile thing, easily bent but not easily broken. The story of the DOJ's exodus was more than a tale of resignations. It was a reflection of a nation grappling with its values, its institutions, and the limits of power. As Sarah looked back on her decision, she felt a quiet resolve. She had chosen the harder path, but it was one she could walk with her head held high.